Morning, everyone. My name is Nathalie Laverge. I've been working with Deloitte for over 20 years in the technology, media, and telecoms industry. The last 4 years in the sustainability team, where I lead the social sustainability team. We have a team of experts like my colleagues Thijs and Sophia, who focus on human rights in general. And as you can imagine, a large part of our work these days is to help clients to comply with the social standards within the CSRD. And we also receive more and more questions about the CSDDD. I'm very pleased that ETIS invited us to share our experience with you. And in the next 15 minutes or so, we will hopefully have an interesting interactive session with you about the important topic of human rights and human rights due diligence. So if we look at the agenda, Sophia will first discuss the social side of the CSRD. Then Thijs will continue to deep dive a bit more into human rights due diligence. Next, we will look at the practical implementations for telcos, and we continue the session with Q&A. As we would like to make the session as interactive as possible, please indeed, as mentioned by Wim, please raise your questions in the chat. We also have included some Mentimeter questions, so if you could keep your phones at hand, that would be good. And I will now hand over to my colleague Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathalie, and thank you everybody for joining this webinar. Very happy to be here. I will start with just an introduction of the social part of CSRD. So CSRD has at its core human rights and labor rights. And as you can see on the screen, this is a text directly from the CSRD Directive. And that shows that the CSRD itself, even before being translated into the ESRS, had some specific information to be disclosed about human rights and social factors. And those were divided into 3 main pillars. The first being equal treatment and opportunities for all, that was then translated into gender equality, equal pay, equal opportunities in terms of trainings and career development, and the inclusion of people with disabilities, just to mention a few. And then the second pillar is about working conditions, so including secure employment and fair working time and adequate wages, and everything that relates to providing fair working condition for employees and for workers in general. And the third pillar is more broader respect for human rights, fundamental freedoms, and all the democratic principles and standards that are included in the different international bills of human rights and the different conventions about human rights. And those 3 pillars not only apply to the workers of the company that are under CSRD, but they have a broader spectrum to the different stakeholders that are included in the social standards of the ESRS, as we are seeing here. So when the ESRS is translated, the CSRD, into practical guidance for companies to what they need to focus on in their disclosure, they created they focus on 4 different stakeholders that companies should take into consideration. So as we mentioned, the own workforce, so the own employees of the company, but also workers in the value chain, so people that work upstream and downstream from the company and that can be impacted directly or indirectly from the company operation, but also affected communities that, again, are both upstream and downstream from the company. It can be affected by the company operation or by the operations of other companies in the value chain, and also then consumers and end users that are the final people that use the products or services that the company provides or that other companies in the value chain provide, and that, of course, are affected by those. And it's worth mentioning that human rights are not only included in the social standard of CSRD, of the ESRSs, but also the cross-cutting standards that are the standards that provide some general indications of how the sustainability statements should be created and how to do the double materiality assessment. They talk about due diligence and ask companies to disclose a statement on due diligence, both on the social part and environmental part. So human rights are also, and human rights due diligence is also included in their overarching standards. And If we dive a bit deeper into what is inside the ESRS standards, we can here we are sharing an example for ESRS S2, that is workers in the value chain, but the structure is very similar for S3 and S4. So companies should disclose more or less the same information about also the impacts on affected communities and end users. And we see that the structure of the ESRS also bring in some concepts that Thijs will show later from the OECD steps and guidance on due diligence. So we see, for example, that the ESRS required to disclose policies related to value chain workers, the impacts on those value chain workers, and how those impacts are managed. Companies also, the ESRS required to identify and assess the different impacts and risk and opportunities related to workers in the value chain or affected communities or end users, and also to engage. So it's very important part of stakeholder engagement to understand the impacts, but also to find ways to remediate those impacts, and actions and targets to mitigate and to manage and to identify those impacts and how the mitigation actions are working through time. So the ESRS very much recall the structure of the due diligence steps that the OECD describes. And now we'll hand it over to Thijs to describe more about the CSRD and the link with the other standards.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining also on my behalf. So indeed, I think if you look at the ESRS standards, they both implicitly and explicitly, by the way, as well, refer to the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, which kind of is the foundation of human rights due diligence as we know it already since 2011. So also in terms of the guidance that has been developed over the years, in that context, it's very relevant to consider when you look at the ESRS disclosure requirements. Now, you're probably also aware of all the other initiatives that the EU has pushed forward over the last couple of years, and that really is a lot. But the ones that are really strongly connected here are, of course, well, the EU taxonomy, which is included in the CSRD, but which also has the article on the minimum safeguards, which before were referred to as the minimum social safeguards, which also contains an obligation for companies to implement the human rights due diligence process, again, aligned to the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. And of course, the CSDDD, the due diligence directive that was finally adopted about 4 months ago, and that member states are currently transposing into national legislation. And where the CSRD is actually focusing on reporting those activities that you're currently conducting without making any obligations on what you should do in that sense. The CSDDD is really the final piece of that puzzle, making it mandatory for companies to actually implement a human rights and environmental due diligence process. Let me quickly see if there's something in the... Oh, okay, sorry. I noticed there was something in the chat, but that's not a question yet. But feel free to ask questions, of course, if you have them. Over the last couple of years, there have also been some national developments when it comes to due diligence obligations. The German Supply Chain Act is an important one there, but also in Norway and France, initiatives have been made to make this more mandatory. Again, if you look at all these different directives and regulations, they are all grounded in these international standards, the guiding principles and guidelines from the OECD. And that's helpful in the sense that because they're all based on that concept, there's a lot of guidance that you can use in interpreting it. I think initially the idea of the Commission was that all these different directives and regulations would fit in nicely together. In practice, there are some discrepancies between what's needed for the different ones in terms of scope of value chain, scope of companies, but also the types of human rights and environmental conventions that are included there. So that's often a challenge to see how to bring that together, and there the UN guiding principles can help as well. Sorry, I need to go to the next slide. Yes, there we are. So the CSDDD, we thought it would be good to also spend a little bit of time on that because it really is strongly connected to the CSRD. Also for companies that are in scope of both directives, the reporting on your CSDDD activities will be done via the CSRD. So there already you see that there's a challenge, of course, because the scope of both directives is not a one-on-one. So that might differ per company and per sector how you approach that, of course. What you see here is that it will come into force in 2027, but in first instance only for the largest companies with over 5,000 employees and 1.5 billion turnover. And then up to 29, you see that it will eventually also, the scope will be broader to the companies with 1,000 employees and the 450 million turnover. There are basically two key elements to the CSDDD. So the one is the due diligence obligation, which is an obvious one, of course. It's a due diligence directive, and this is basically the first time on a European level that human rights and environmental due diligence really becomes mandatory. Some elements of that due diligence process, and I'll get to that a bit later as well, are quite explicit in the directive already, but a lot of elements are still very, very generic, sector agnostic, and therefore there's still a challenge to interpret that and to see how that will be developing going forward. Another important one is that there's an obligation for companies to adopt and implement a climate transition plan. Of course, under the CSRD, this is something that you already need to disclose on, but there's still the opportunity to disclose that you're not having it. Under the CSDDD, it will become mandatory. It needs to be science-based. It needs to be aligned to the 1.5 degree scenario of the Paris Agreement. But also there's some language included as a result of all the negotiations that it's a best effort obligation. And so also there we have to see how it would work out in practice. Let me quickly pause here to see if there are any questions from your side on this one. And otherwise, we'll dive a little bit more into the concept of human rights due diligence. Well, as mentioned by Sophia already, this is very much a reference point also in the ESRS standards. But before we go further, maybe let's start with a few Mentimeter questions. If I might ask you all to either go to the website or scan the QR code. Just want to get a bit of an understanding of where you are within the company in terms of human rights due diligence and material topics to consider. Could you share your screen? And
Yes. So see some.
okay. There we are. And the first answers are coming in. Okay, it's good. But it's interesting scoring there. It's an even one. I think what we always see is that, and with our clients, that if you are already implementing a human rights due diligence process, that really enables you also to report, I would say, maybe a bit more easily on the social standards. So especially the value chain standards under CSRD, as it's so aligned to that concept. If you are not already implementing this, then I can only recommend to have a good look at that at the moment because, well, again, it's really beneficial from a CSRD perspective. You also need to disclose what you're doing in terms of due diligence when it comes to human rights and environmental impacts as part of this cross-cutting standards. And for those of you that will fall within the scope of the CSDDD, it will become mandatory to have it implemented in 3 to 5 years from now. Might seem far away, but it really takes quite a lot of effort, as the ones that have done it already would know, to actually implement it and get everybody aligned on that. If you go to the next one. And I know from some of you that you do. I don't know it for everyone, so let's see what the results are here. And I think also here, of course, if you're already reporting on the topic, that's very helpful. And then what we see is that although CSRD requires maybe a slightly different approach to reporting, and the level of quality might be different than the reporting that we've seen in this area over the last couple of years. The essence, of course, is the same, that it is intended to clarify to your external stakeholders how you're managing topics on the human rights side within your own company, but especially also to those people outside of the organization that might be affected by either your own operations or that of your business partners. So in that sense, the objective is probably similar. The approach might be slightly different because of the standards that were developed. If we go to the next one. Let's see. I'm happy to see that this is all going towards the yes. I might be biased, but I think that for each and every company, this should be a material topic. And of course, it can differ a little bit where in the value chain it's most material and which stakeholders are mostly affected by it. But especially from an impact perspective, so from not looking at the financial materiality, maybe because that's often not that obvious when it comes to human rights, but from the impact perspective, it is definitely something that should be considered material. So very happy with this result. Maybe move to the next one. Now this is then only for, well, it's completely irrelevant, I think. So thank you. I think these were the questions for now, right? Yeah. All right. I'll go back to the presentation.
Can I maybe ask a question in between?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
I'm from Swisscom telecommunications company, and I'm currently like evaluating the S2 and S3 in our DMA, and we don't really have production sites in our value chain, own production sites. So our impact is mainly through our suppliers. And of course, human rights are a relevant topic for us as well. We have a due diligence process, etc. We work with our suppliers, but I'm currently negotiating also with our auditor whether we can include the whole human rights topic under G1 management with suppliers. Because we don't really have a direct impact. So all these topics listed under S2, working hours, etc., of course, they're relevant, but we don't have really a material direct impact. What we can do is work with our suppliers. Do you have experience with this? How companies handle this if they have a really indirect impact in the lower supply chain?
Yeah, so I think, and that's aligned also again to the UN guiding principles. So there's this distinction between causing an impact, contributing to an impact, or being directly linked to an impact, right? So especially for impacts in your value chain, it's quite likely that you're not contributing to that because it's further away. There's no direct control over it, but you are directly linked, and you're considered to be directly linked, and therefore there's a responsibility to use the leverage that you have to indeed engage with your suppliers on it to see if you can urge them to prevent or mitigate and remediate those kind of impacts. And then indeed, if you look at the governance standards, of course, there's also some requirements around your supplier engagement, maybe even code of conduct reporting. So I do see that there's a connection there. I think that the difference is that for the social standards, and that also goes back to the due diligence process and the materiality assessment. If you've identified that, let's say, working conditions with your direct suppliers or with your tier 2 suppliers might be a heightened risk and therefore are material, then I think the social standards are really the right vehicle to disclose on your approach there, because they really ask you on how you are managing those material topics, where the governance standards are indeed a bit more on responsible business conduct, maybe in general, and the way that you engage with your suppliers, which is very much connected and relevant, but it's a slightly different approach, I think.
Yeah, but also like from what I understood is that we have to identify IROs on subtopic level, which are very granular in the S2 and S3 standards. So we actually go into working hours, fair remuneration, all these topics, and this is very hard to distinguish and also like have policies, especially for excessive working hours, for example. So we tackle these issues actually as a package. We know where the most important risks are, but it's not possible for us to really go that deep into the value chain and yeah, have a policy for each IRO, you know?
Yeah, so I think if you look at your policies, of course, so on the one hand, you identify risks which are outside of your own operations, but then the way in which you manage those risks or the way that you use your leverage are, of course, very much focused on your own efforts, so your own business model, your own approach to it. So if you have a code of conduct or you have a human rights policy that refers to specific labor standards from the ILO, for instance, or the Universal Declaration, in the way that you expect your suppliers to adhere to that, then that will be the things to disclose under the social standards, I think.
Okay.
And it gives you a bit more room also to explain the actions that you take and the engagement that you have to understand and to create an environment in which your suppliers might be acting more in the way that they adhere to your code of conduct.
Okay, thank you.
We also have a more general question from Thomas related to the CSRD impact and also linking it to the Draghi report and the new commission. We can take it now or we can take it at the end. By coincidence, we discussed it before the webinar as well, the ETIS and the Deloitte people. But do you want to comment already on it now? And perhaps, Thomas, you can explain the question first.
No. The thing is, I'm not Thomas speaking, not an expert for all these details here. But what I'm seeing is, of course, there is quite a catalogue of legal requirements, and what is also was presented in the talks so far, they're not necessarily aligned or necessarily harmonized. So there is now these legal requirements or regulatory requirements, and there's of course also then at the other side there are comments by the EU Commission, also by Draghi, saying, well, we are in terms of international global competition, we have to maybe harmonize and make this much less complex. And I just wonder where we stand on that, because I could imagine with all the requirements, legal requirements, not only for this portion, companies will start really to suffer from that. And I think there is a kind of a wake-up call that you can hear from the legislator or the commission saying, well, we have to work on that. And I just would like to understand, where do we stand there? Will there be a change? Will there be whatever streamlining? So what can you say about that?
Yeah, no, it's a clear question, and indeed, let's touch upon it now so that we can move forward. We briefly discussed indeed before the session. I think the remarks from van der Leyen, which were quite recent, also kind of got everyone by surprise, in the sense that, of course, initially the intention was that everything would be very much aligned, but we've seen that during the negotiations there's been some divergence between the different topics, so the CSRD, CSDDD, EU taxonomy. I think what van der Leyen also said, right, is that they should look at the efficiency, but without changing really the core of the directives. But it clearly opens up the door to more uncertainty, and that's I would say that's a pity. it's very hard to already say where this will be going. I mean, yeah, it clearly opens up the discussion again a bit. On the other hand, the CSDDD, especially, companies haven't even gotten started by implementing it. So to already question whether it's too much is also an interesting timing. I don't expect that there will be much changes in that sense. That it's quite clearly that, and that's also that people from the European Union are mentioning more and more that all the three are grounded in the UN guiding principles and OECD guidelines, and the objective of the three different pieces of legislation is quite clear, that the Commission wants companies to implement due diligence and to be transparent about their efforts to manage human rights and environmental impacts. Now, for the Commission to actually change the directives or the regulations, that will be quite an intense political process again, I expect. So then it's quite unlikely that will be done in a short period of time. If you look at the ESRS standards, which are delegated acts, it might be more easy for the Commission to make some changes there. But it's also it's I would say a bit too early to make a good assessment of where this will be going. But it's definitely not helping, because finally we've got the text from the directives. I mean, the first companies are now reporting on CSRD in a few months, and then this is of course creating a lot of unrest, and that's not helping the cause, of course.
Any other views on this?
And Thomas again, the point is, and what we see also for the automotive industry in Germany, for instance, and I'm following the discussions because my origins are, of course, German. It seems to me, when it comes to economic challenges, issues, that all of a sudden, and there's a discussion in Germany also on climate change and climate development, that we may see certain giving up of rules, requirements, that where we say, well, this may impact the economic performance of the continent. So this seems to me that this is, I don't know, going in a certain direction, and it's interesting to watch that. But in the end of the day, I mean, there's a reporting requirement, and we put all our efforts now in that, and it's of course an I don't know, a challenge maybe if you see there a softening or change even of these requirements, and we invest now a lot of efforts in that, and all of a sudden we may face the point that it's no more that much strictly required as it was maybe in the past because of the economic conditions. Just my views on that. Okay, thank you.
Sure. No, and it's of course, I mean, it's the European political climate, but it's also beyond Europe, of course, right? Where we see that there's some pushback on certain elements when it comes to the climate and human rights agenda. But also, yeah, that I mean, that's on such a different level that it's very hard to predict where it will actually go. Maybe taking it back to the presentation, because we thought it would be good to show also a bit of the timeline when we look at the developments here and there. I mean, I think the idea of businesses having a responsibility, I mean, that's not new, right? So with the International Labour Organization, which was founded just after the First World War, the UN Declaration on Universal Rights after the Second World War, it's clearly moving in that direction. Then the OECD with their guidelines in the 70s. And I think one of the most important ones, if you look at the framework now, is the adoption of the UN guiding principles in 2011, which were unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council of the UN, and integrated in the OECD guidelines. But I think what we've seen over the last couple of years is that where this used to be much more of a voluntary set of guidelines and principles that some companies adhere to early on. Others took a bit more time, but also a group of companies was not really picking up on this. And that's why I think about 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago, much more emphasis came on legislation. With now the CSDDD being the latest and I would say most progressive piece of legislation on a fairly large level in the EU, but also with affect companies that are operating in the EU but are not based in the EU. So if you look at it from this perspective, I think it's clear in which directions these developments are going. There's a clear responsibility to companies. It's moving a bit away from the solidly voluntary principles towards more mandatory. Certain countries already have their own legislation in that field. For instance, the German Supply Chain Act. And that's now, of course, with the intention to create a level playing field. Europe has stepped in there as well to make sure that at least in the European market, all companies have more or less the same obligations. So, what the next dot on this line will be and which direction that will go in the short term might be a bit unclear, but I think in the long term we see this development of much more legislative pressure on companies to make sure that their business is organized responsibly. So then I'm quickly going to dive a bit into the UN guiding principles. As I said, I think that still the most important set of principles that really give direction to human rights, but also environmental due diligence nowadays, and they were adopted in 2011. And it's always good to mention that if also within this the concept of the UN guiding principles, states remain primarily responsible to protect human rights. Right? It's in no way meant to shift that responsibility to the corporate sector, but the assumption is that also if not every state might be in a position to do this in a way that we would want to make sure that everybody has its human rights respected and that the environment is protected. And therefore, they created this three-pillar approach where there's also attention to the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Basically saying that no matter what states do, as a company, you need to make sure that your own operations are not adversely impacting the rights of people within your organizations or throughout the value chain. I think that's an important element there. And the other one is the remedy pillar. So in a case where there is an adverse impact on people, and especially if you're causing that, so if it was in your own operations, for instance, or if you're contributing to it, then there's a responsibility to provide remediation for that. I would say it's a very important element because without the remediation part, what does it bring people? And the right to remedy in itself is a human right, which is established in several international treaties and covenants. Then if you look at the responsibility to respect human rights within the UN guiding principles, again, translated to all the other documents, that is basically you need to have a commitment clearly stated, publicly available, to respect human rights, and you need to make sure that that is also translated into your business processes, procedures, operations, that everybody is aware of that. And then at the heart of that responsibility is the due diligence process. It has been integrated in the OECD guidelines, and it's basically a 6-step framework on due diligence. It starts with this policy commitment. Then you have to identify impacts and risks, again, throughout the full value chain. If you identify those, you need to come up with tailored actions to prevent or mitigate them. You need to track the effectiveness there. You need to communicate about it, which is an important part of the due diligence process in itself. So in that sense, it's also interesting to see that we now have a CSRD, which refers to the due diligence process, but the communication is actually an essential part of the process itself as well. And the remediation part is the 6th step there. Throughout this process, and that's also in the CSDDD now explicitly mentioned, is the obligation to have meaningful engagement with stakeholders. It basically means that you need to talk to the people that are affected or their representatives or proxies that can inform you on the effects that your business or the business of your relationships might have on people. It's basically to make sure that you can make an informed decision on both the identification of impacts, but also on the approach to prevent and mitigate them and to provide remediation. I'm gonna move forward a bit. So here you see the different steps as they were created by the OECD. I just mentioned them, of course. And here's also the overview of the different ways in which a company can be actually linked to an impact. Again, if you're causing the impact, so even at Deloitte, there might be a case in which someone feels discriminated, that might be up to us, then there's a responsibility for us, of course, to make sure that that doesn't happen again and to provide remediation for something like that. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the directly linked, and that basically says that any impact that takes place in your value chain that has been caused by a company that's linked to your products and services should be considered as an impact that's relevant to you as a company as well. The challenge, of course, is that this can even be very far away. You can think of the mining of raw materials. So then you're directly linked to potential child labor in mining. And the question, of course, is then what can you do as a company? Now, again, if you look at what you can do, then the first thing to look at is, of course, what can you do within your own operations? What can you do in terms of policy commitments, in terms of your supplier engagement? Maybe you have a few suppliers that are creating that connection and you can engage with them to explain the importance of having strong policies and strong management systems in place to eventually, like top down, try to influence the situation there. On the other hand, even if it's a very severe impact, a very salient issue in terms of human rights language, you might also consider other ways to influence more directly and look at maybe peers or other organizations that facing the same problem, collaborating with them, trying to more bottom up, try to advance the human rights of people that might be affected. And also that collaboration is an important part now of the CSDDD. So there's a lot of attention on what you can do. So it's also not intended to, let's say, identify high risk areas and then shift your business towards other areas to avoid that it becomes part of your business, of your value chain. But the intention is really to look at where the risks are within your value chain and to identify if there's anything you can do to advance the situation there. And only if there's really nothing to do and there are alternatives available, then you might consider to disengage with certain partners within your value chain. But even then, there's this responsibility to make sure that you also balance the impact that might have on people. So it's not an obligation that there can be any violations anymore within your value chain, but it's really an obligation to make sure that you're having a proper risk management system in place to act once you identify some. Any questions on that? Otherwise, we just have two examples of human rights due diligence elements from some of your peers that we thought are good examples of how it can be addressed. Or no? Oh, sorry, and we have another Mentimeter. So we'll go back to that one. Yeah. Give you a few minutes to get ready again.
Yeah, we can maybe also discuss already some human rights issues for telcos that we have identified.
I think it's interesting that the way that the CSRD is now asking you to report on this is, of course, also very much looking at upstream, upstream from a raw material perspective, for instance. And I think in general, there's been a lot of intention also more on the downstream side and the use of technology in relation to governments and states in the way and what you can do there. And of course, it's a complicated one because in terms of leverage, that's always hard. So then, again, if there's a risk there on that side, then the question might be much more on the development of your products and how you can design them in a way that they can be used responsible and that they're not misused for anything, for instance. Here we see some of the social security tax, an interesting one. I think health and safety, that's one that for almost each and every industry comes up high, which makes sense, especially if you consider the value chain, because we're all connected to so many different activities throughout that value chain. By exploitation, access to remedy. Again, I think that's a very important one because in the end, that's the one that might matter the most to the people that are affected. So really good to see that here as well. And there's maybe one other thing to consider. So what we see in the human rights field is that often companies do a saliency assessment, which is kind of similar to the materiality assessment, but often a more detailed level. So where you might report on working conditions more generically within the CSRD context, from a human rights perspective, it's really important to know what are the impacts, risks, and opportunities within that bucket, so to say, and where does it take place. So if you would take working conditions in the value chain as a generic topic for reporting, that might be fit for purpose. But from a management perspective, of course, it's quite broad and it would be hard to have actual actions implemented to manage that. So I think that's also where the whole human rights saliency and double materiality can kind of fit in together. Good. Do you all recognize these topics? I guess the bigger ones are the ones that come up more. Yeah. So that also makes sense. Maybe we can move to the next one.
While they are doing this one, we can go to the next slide and then we can just have a look.
Yeah, I have to go to another presentation. So let's give it a minute and then we move on to the next one.
Because maybe we can share a bit of what we see with our clients, which is the biggest challenge when it comes to reporting human rights. So here, maybe we can give an example.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with the stakeholder engagement, I think.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, and I think a more generic challenge with the CSRD is that it's often very specific in what you need to report, and you might be doing a lot on a certain topic already, but then the challenge is to fit it in the framework of CSRD. I think in general, stakeholder engagement, meaningful stakeholder engagement, and finding the right, let's say, representatives to talk to is definitely a challenge. I think what we also see is that when it comes to targets and metrics for the value chain disclosures, there's not many companies that are really advanced there. Of course, there's no obligation under CSRD to have it. You only have to report it if you're working with it. But it is an interesting part of the whole management framework, of course, which eventually would very much strengthen your approach if you can come up with the right KPIs and targets to manage to track the performance there. I'm not sure if there's anyone else that wants to share anything here. Yeah, that's also a good one. And there is, by the way, when it comes to this and for information in your value chain, there's a phase-in period. There's a more generic phase-in period for companies, for the smaller companies, I would say. But especially when it comes to data, there's don't know the disclosure requirement by heart, I must admit. But you have, I think, a phase-in period of 3 years for the information that you need, where you rely on information from your value chain partners. So indeed, acknowledging that it's not easy to get that data, especially if you're talking about maybe your SME suppliers that are not as advanced as others maybe are. So I think there the Commission and EFRAG, the standard setting board, have acknowledged that that's an issue, and therefore there's a bit more time to gather that information. But yeah, that challenge is real, and there's not really a one-size-fits-all solution for that. Unfortunately, there's of course a lot of tooling available already and still being developed to meet these requirements. But it's a challenge we see a lot. Okay, I will move back to the presentation, because there I think, see if this goes right. Yeah. I think we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. But I think if you look at the topics that come up frequently within your sector, then this is, I think it's not rocket science. And many of these topics you probably recognize, and they're also not solidly relevant to the telecom sector or the tech industry, of course. I think the responsible use of new technologies, that's really an interesting one. We'll in a bit show you an example on the introduction of the 5G network, but of course also there's a lot of attention now to the developments around AI and how that would impact people, and maybe not even the AI itself, but also how that might have influence some of the other risks and impacts that are out there, and so it can also build up to a bigger impact because of the reach and because of the way technology is being used at the moment. Freedom of expression is of course one that's very closely linked, where there's a big opportunity and a big positive impact element to it, and at the same time there can of course also be a risk there. So I think those are very relevant. And then looking at the consumers and end users again, but children's rights is also a topic that's of course there's a lot of attention to in terms of the use of media. And then maybe just quickly on the other one, so on the affected community side and the workers in the value chain, it's topics like child labor and forced labor and resettlement for affected communities, which might not be the obvious topics that have come up in the past. But again, taking that full value chain approach and the core elements of human rights due diligence, these are topics to consider because of the scope of the directive.
There is a question related to the source of the examples given.
I don't think it's a single source. What we did is based on our experience and the companies we've worked with also in your sector, and we looked at some of the reports and we identified some of the topics that come up there. So this is definitely not an exhaustive list of topics that you should consider, but this is what we see as topics that come up within your industry.
Okay, fine, thanks.
Yeah. And then I quickly want to highlight two examples that we thought were nice to share. This one is from Ericsson, and this links also to the responsible use of new technology. So I think in 2020, Ericsson did a dedicated impact assessment on the effects of the introduction of 5G, of the 5G network, and what the human rights implications would be there. And on the one hand, they looked indeed at what are the risks with the development of the network and more from a constructional side, but also how that might affect people in the way that it increases access to the Internet of Things, which was especially back then was a big thing looking into. So they did an assessment on how the introduction of this new network would actually influence their existing identified risks and what kind of mitigating measures they could take on a very specific topic. And this, taking it then back to the CSRD, this would fit very nicely within that reporting framework, where you could look at the different stakeholder groups that are affected. You can show the impact of a specific introduction, and you can then share the actions that you take to prevent and mitigate that. maybe you all know this report. I find it very useful. I can really recommend to go through it if you have the time and you are looking for some inspiration on this. And then, cautious of time, the other one is an example from Telefonica that did an update on their impact assessment. This was not within the context of CSRD, but I think the way that they are being transparent about that, both on the process side, so how they actually executed their impact assessment, as well as the results from it, so the identification of their salient issues, and the follow-up that they intend to do around these topics linked to the due diligence wheel, so to say. I think that for them would be a very good basis, again, to feed into the reporting requirements of CSRD. So again, for those that are already reporting on human rights from the more voluntary standards, maybe that information really fits in nicely within the CSRD requirements. I noticed that we have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to stop here. Maybe there are some final questions.
Who wants to go first?
And if not, then thank you very much for your attention.
Nobody has a question?
If there are no questions at this moment, but they will come up later, you please reach out to us. We have our email addresses, I think, in this presentation, or can be shared by ETIS. We have a lot of contacts, of course, also within Deloitte in other countries than the Netherlands. We're doing this from Netherlands, but we are closely connected to our colleagues in other countries. So for any specific country-specific regulation, or just anything you wanted to discuss, we're always open to that.
Yeah, maybe I have a question. I don't know if you hear me.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Sorry, I missed the beginning of the presentation, so I'm not sure that maybe it was already said. Leila Jmili, I'm working at Proximus. Just started.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, because I saw that for the CSDDD, we are expected to launch an human rights impact assessment in a dynamic way, like every year. And I don't know if you already presented some solution in terms of tooling, because I guess that with IA, it's possible to do that in an efficient way, right?
Good question. And there's a lot of tooling out there that can be used to support your impact assessment. But indeed, so I'm not sure if you need to do it on an annual basis, by the way, but you need to repeatedly, it's an ongoing process. So you need to indeed identify the high-risk areas when it comes to environmental and human rights impacts. And for instance, to identify these hotspots and to help you navigate your supply chain, there are multiple tools available already, and I mean, companies keep working on that. Also, you might already be working with certain supplier platforms like EcoVadis or one of the other providers there, or with data providers. I'm not sure if you're already doing that. They're also working on solutions for this. So there's a lot out there. We actually have a whole team that's continuously scanning everything that's going on, because of course it's a hot topic. I don't really have one or two tools that I would say these are the ones, because it depends very much on, of course, what you're currently doing and where your needs are. But I mean, looking into deep tooling is definitely something that can be beneficial from an efficiency perspective.
Okay, because I was wondering if we were in the process of updating our next double materiality analysis, and I remember that we were supposed that for each impact, risk, and opportunities, if I'm not mistaken, at least the impact, I'm sure, that we were expected to say if there is a negative impact on human rights. And I was wondering if by doing this exercise, then it's considered as an human rights impact assessment. Can we merge the two exercises, basically, instead of doing two? And
So briefly touched upon that, I think, but So indeed, the double materiality assessment in CSRD is looking at impact, risk, and opportunities. So really the impact materiality and the financial materiality. If you look at the CSDDD, that's really focused on impact. So that's not about financial materiality. That's really on the impact to people. And I think what mentioned before was that what we see is that the level of detail within a due diligence, human rights and environmental due diligence risk assessment often goes a bit deeper than what we see in double materiality exercises at the moment, because the purpose is different. Like in the double materiality, you're deciding which topics are material to disclose within the context of CSRD, where from a due diligence perspective, you might need a bit more detail on topics because it's much more about how can we manage, how can we influence, etc. So maybe as an example, if there's an issue with adequate wages in a certain area within your supply chain, then that might be flagged within your due diligence risk assessment, but maybe together with other working related rights. And then from a reporting perspective, it can be the case that working conditions at a more generic level would be a material topic to disclose on, because you cannot disclose on each and every single underlying impact, risk, or opportunity, of course. So I think the CSRD also says that the outcomes of your sustainability due diligence process should feed into your double materiality assessment, acknowledging that they're related, but also they're not one-on-one the same.
Yeah.
I hope that's helpful.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Good.
I think we reached the end of the webinar and also the time slot foreseen. So I want to thank Deloitte, Nathalie, Thijs, and Sophia for the insightful presentation, also the tips for the reports. We'll share the link of the recording and also of the presentation with you this afternoon. As already mentioned, this is a series of webinars, so looking forward to meet you in a future webinar, and definitely also in the ETIS gathering in June, planned in Athens. Have a great day, enjoy lunch, and see you soon for another ETIS activity. Bye-bye.